joining us right now, and so I'm going to wait for a moment or two to get started. We have a fun little program tonight about our latest installation in our collections gallery. So I look forward to lots of time for questions and answers and a fun little trip through the French countryside with all of you tonight.
That sounds like fun.
If only we could all go in reality. That would be more fun than this. All right. I think we are just about all here. We're piling in now. This program will be recorded, and it'll take us a day or two to get some editing done. But hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow, this and our latest Focus Friday presentation will be up on our website and on our YouTube channel, and we'll be able to share with your friends if they weren't able to join us for this evening. So tonight we are going to talk about our latest exhibition at the Leepa-Rattner Museum of Art, and that is Abraham Ratner's French Watercolors. This is a really little sort of beautiful boutique exhibition that we have on view right now in our collections galleries. So they're the first galleries when you enter the museum in our more or less our permanent collection. So all of these items are housed in the museum and part of what makes up the over 7,500 items in the Leepa-Rattner Museum of Art's collections. Throughout his career, Abraham Ratner was driven by an inner need to create. He was rarely without art-making materials, and he often worked in the medium of watercolors because it was easy, and it was easy to make immediately. As a colorist, Ratner also enjoyed sort of the luminosity of watercolors for capturing the spirit of light. And it's the same reason we see a lot of impressionists embracing watercolors. He highlighted in this exhibition that we have on view right now at the museum are watercolors from sort of the early years of Abraham Ratner's career, documenting his travels throughout France in the 1920s and the 1930s. Tonight, we'll take a look back at the time in his life that he lived in Paris and traveled throughout France with his watercolors and his journals, documenting his time there, the scenery, and the people that he met. So many of you are probably familiar with Abraham Ratner, being patrons of the museum and members. But for those of you who aren't, Abraham Ratner is an American artist who was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, to a Russian Jewish father and a Romanian Jewish mother. His parents had immigrated to the United States, mostly to escape sort of the anti-Semitism that was present in Tsarist Russia. He was the second of 6 children, including his elder brother Louis, his younger brothers Manuel, otherwise known as Manny, and Harry, and his younger sisters Rose and Jenny. And this is a picture in our archives of the house that Abraham Ratner grew up in. Abraham Ratner's parents really encouraged him to paint from a very young age. And as he grew up, painting became part of his daily life. He graduated from Poughkeepsie High School in the year 1912 and left to study initially architecture at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. At night, he took art courses at the Corcoran School of Art and soon became a full-time art student, preferring that over architecture. He applied for a scholarship to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia and was accepted in 1919 and supported himself throughout his studies by doing illustrations for Philadelphia's newspapers. Ratner was first really exposed to the medium of watercolor while studying at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts between the years 1916 and 1919. His sort of studies at the school were interrupted by none other than World War I. His service in the U.S. Army really sort of divided his life, but also gave us sort of the catalyst for his incredible artistic expression. His mentors at the Philadelphia Academy of the Fine Arts embraced Impressionism and plein air or outdoor painting at the time as a serious artistic expression, which was sort of new and avant-garde at the time. Although a lot of people were painting outside, they were mostly studies that were then taken back into their studios and fully fleshed out by artists. During Ratner's time there, one of his teachers, Arthur B. Carles, created the Chester Springs Summer Campus, which helped students learn to paint landscapes in an outdoor setting. And this learning experience had a really profound effect on Abraham Ratner and his works throughout the rest of his life. So as we mentioned, in 1917, World War I interrupted Abraham Ratner's studies. He entered the United States Army in France, where he became Sergeant of Camouflage Section, 40th Engineers. Camouflage, reflecting aspects of modern art in its form and its pattern, made use of his artistic skills. During the Second Battle of the Marne, Ratner, however, injured his back and was returned to the States with an ailment that would affect him for the rest of his life. When he returned to the US, he returned to the Pennsylvania Academy, and in the year 1919, he was awarded the Crescent Scholarship to study art in Europe. The Crescent Scholarship, otherwise known as the William Emlyn Crescent Memorial Traveling Scholarship, that's a mouthful, so we just shortened it. It's a 2-year scholarship for foreign travel or study, which is awarded each year to art students at the Pennsylvania Academy. It's awarded for excellence in the arts, and the prize was funded initially by Emlyn and Priscilla Crescent in memory of their son, who had been an alumni of the Academy and died in the year 1868 at the age of only 23. He had been a child prodigy painter who began exhibiting at the Academy at the age of 11. The very first Crescent traveling scholarships were awarded in the year 1902. Initially, they were just $1,000, which was a lot of money then, of course, but they were 1-year scholarships, renewable for a second year and sometimes beyond. Multiple awards were given in painting initially, along with one in sculpture and one in architecture, and later on, by the time Ratner received his award in 1919, illustration had been added as one of the award categories. This award allowed Ratner to continue his art studies in Europe. He traveled for 1 year, then settled in Paris for the next 20 years of his life. Although Ratner exhibited his oil paintings in the French salons, he continued to paint watercolors to record his travels throughout Europe. His documentations, from steerage passengers on transatlantic crossings to his time spent living in Giverny, to vacations on the Brittany coast and trips to the Mediterranean island of Corsica, are all an important reflection of his time in Europe. Those 20 years in Paris became the most formative years of Ratner's life because he was able to study and experiment with futurism, cubism, and expressionism. Post-World War I Paris was the center of modern culture for Americans disillusioned by the destruction of the war. Expatriate writers, poets, and artists were searching for a culture that shunned the traditions of the past and exchanged ideas with one another at the lively Paris cafes and salons. When you think of Paris in the 1920s, you think of sort of this lost generation of artists and authors. This legendary group flocked to the French capital in terms of an escape during America's sort of back to normal campaign following World War I. They spent their time in the salons and in cafes, working on their art, poems, and novels, and socializing in their favorite hangout spots, bohemian, boozy jazz bars, many of which you can still visit today. Imagine the likes of Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, Pablo Picasso, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Abraham Ratner all swapping ideas, hopes, and dreams. Then you can go and visit these historic places yourself. These 3 are still open today. The Les Deux Magots Café, the Café de Flore, and the Le Closet de la Lasse, which are all still in operation, And as soon as we all are vaccinated, maybe we can take a trip there together. Ernest Hemingway wrote, "There is never any ending to Paris, and the memory of each person who has lived in it differs from that of any other. But this is how Paris was in the early days when we were all very poor and very happy." These cafes and salons were really sort of the headquarters for almost all of the famous writers and artists, and they gave the opportunity to Abraham Ratner to hobnob and form friendships with artists from all over the globe. Ratner seldom went anywhere without his sketchbooks and journals. Today, the Leepa-Rattner Museum of Art holds nearly all of Ratner's journals and sketchbooks, save for those that were donated to the Smithsonian Archives. The two seen here are on view. The one on the left is an illustration in his journal entitled "Courtyard of My Home in Paris," which was painted in the year 1922. These are watercolor pen and inks on paper. After first touring Europe when he arrived in 1920, Ratner settled on a small working farm near the town of Giverny, which is just northwest of Paris. Giverny is really a commune on the northern French department of Eure. This village is located on the right bank of the Seine, lying about 50 miles west-northwest of Paris in the old province of Normandy. The illustration that you see on the left is on view in the gallery. That is Abraham Ratner's 10th of the Harvest Farm, painted in Giverny in 1920. Abraham Ratner and other artists lived on a farm, and just adjacent to it, to where Ratner was living and working, was none other than the home of aging Impressionist artist Claude Monet, still painting his famous lily ponds in the gardens of his estate. Ratner lived with many other artists at Fern de la Dame, and they would often hide in the bushes near the gardens, hoping to catch a glimpse of Monet at work. Ratner reminisced in his journals, "I used to watch Monet paint at 83 years of age. He was standing up at work, solid as an old tree trunk, holding his palette in one hand and swinging with his right arm, straight arm from one side of the canvas to the other." Claude Monet himself had noticed the village of Giverny when looking out of a train window. He made up his mind to move to this town and rented a house in the area surrounding it. In 1890, Monet had enough money to buy the house and land outright and set out to create the magnificent gardens that he wanted to paint. Some of his most famous paintings were of the gardens in Giverny, famous for its rectangular cloisonnement and with archways of climbing plants entwined around colored shrubs. His water garden formed by a tributary, and the Japanese bridge, the pond with the water lilies, the wisterias, and the azaleas. On the left, you can see one of Monet's paintings, and on the right, you can see a photograph of the bridge and the gardens as they are in Giverny today. Beginning around the year 1887, several American Impressionist artists settled to work in Giverny alongside Monet. They were drawn by the landscapes, the overall atmosphere, and of course, the presence of the great artist. These included Willard Metcalf, Louis Rittman, Theodore Wendell, and John Leslie Breck. Soon, many Americans extended their visits from summer through the entire year. American painter Theodore Earl Butler ended up marrying Monet's stepdaughter and sometimes model, Suzanne Hocht, there in 1892. And Friedrich Karl Friesque spent every summer from the year 1906 through 1919 in a residence right next door to Monet's. The term decorative impressionist was coined in 1911 to describe this artist's work, and the term described sort of the second wave of American painters in Giverny that accompanied artists like Abraham Ratner. These artists, the 6 of these artists in December, These Giverny artists, as they became known, such as Lawton Parker, Guy Rose, and Edmund Graken, were given a show at the Madison Galleries in New York, which termed them the Giverny Group. The First World War largely marked the end of the art colony, but afterwards, artists returned to the area, flocking again to the beautiful landscapes. Monet's property at Giverny, both his house and gardens, have been left by his son to the Academy of Beaux-Arts in 1966. They have become a museum that's now open to the public to visit after completion of a large-scale restoration work in 1980. The huge studio was restored. The precious collection of Monet's Japanese woodblock prints was displayed in several rooms and hung in the manner chosen by the master himself. The gardens today have been replanted as they once were, and the house is a popular tourist attraction, particularly in the summer, of course, when the flowers are all in bloom. Leaving Giverny, Ratner traveled throughout Europe in the 1920s, primarily by steamship. He created a series of watercolors showcasing many of the people that he met on these journeys, particularly showcasing steerage passengers on ocean liners. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, steerage is really sort of the lower decks of the ship, where cargo is stored above closed holds, or open decks where people are sort of piled in, almost like cattle. These decks were used to provide the lowest cost and lowest class of travel, often for European and Chinese immigrants to North America, but also for the new and emerging working classes in Europe. With limited privacy and security, inadequate sanitary conditions, and poor food, steerage was often decried as inhumane and was eventually replaced on ocean liners with third-class cabins. In these early works of Abraham Ratner, we see the use of flat areas of color, elevated vantage points, and really only essential details used to depict the scenes. The images show people huddled on decks, clutching their worldly possessions. Themes of forced migration, refugeeism, and the overall plight of the human condition can be seen in these early works, which were themes that Ratner continued to explore throughout the rest of his artistic career.
I am. I just am an artist, I can tell.
This piece that you see here is technically called Untitled, but it is composition on a fellowship. And this was painted in 1920 as Ratner traveled. Additional works seen here are more in this sort of steerage series. And here you can see an image of how women were often segregated, of course, at the time from men in these steerage decks on these steamships in the 20s. These ships were often overcrowded with standing room only for steerage passengers. Long-haul trips were fraught with disease and danger, but throughout the French Riviera, where Ratner was primarily traveling, the emerging working class was using steerage as a way to get out and explore Europe after World War I. As Ratner continued to document his travels, his style began to change, replacing the essential details with sort of these sweeping brushstrokes that were more expressive and direct to quickly capture these bustling ports and these quick little vignettes of things he was seeing. This work is entitled Boat with Sailor and Anchor. So you can kind of see right in the center here, you see our sailor's face and his two arms as he's hauling in a net. And of course, you can see the anchor here. Eventually, Abraham Ratner arrived in the port town of Dieppe, located on the northern shore along the English Channel. This is one of France's oldest seaside resorts. Ratner often painted along the rocky coastline and the beaches of the town during the late 1920s and the 1930s. This port was essential for all sorts of European trade and travel. a port located directly on the English Channel. It's also at the mouth of the Arx River, famous for its scallops, and it hosted regular ferry service to New Haven in England. Dieppe also had a popular pebbled beach, a 15th century castle, and the churches of Saint Jacques and Saint Remy. And here on the right, you can see Ratner's image of cabanas on the beach from 1932. And you really get a sense of sort of this pebbled beach that he was depicting through the use of his different colors on the sea and the shore. On the left is his rendition of the Dieppe port. And so you get the sense, the real sort of bustling sense with the smokestacks and all the movement conveyed through his watercolors of just how busy this port city was. During this period, Ratner's figurative studies were often drawn in a sort of neoclassical style, which was influenced by his formal training at the Pennsylvania Academy, as well as the art schools in Paris. As he became more immersed in the Parisian art scene, his style continued to evolve. He was influenced by artists and art genres like surrealism and cubism, and he began to capture the essence of his abstracted figures with fluid lines and bold colors. In 1924, Abraham Ratner married Bettina Bedwell, who was an American art student and a fashion illustrator. She became the Paris fashion correspondent for the New York News Chicago Tribune Syndicate. On the left, you see, of course, a beautiful chic image of Bettina. In the center, you can see the portrait of her that Ratner painted, which is on view at the museum. And in the bottom right, this is one of her traveling trunks. In 1927, Ratner was a member of the Minotaur Group, along with Picasso, Miro, Giacometti, Le Corbusier, Braque, Dali, and Riverd. This group, of course, later became responsible for Minotaur, which was a surrealist-oriented magazine founded by Albert Schiera in Paris and published in the years 1933 and 1939. That magazine published on the plastic arts, poetry, and literature, and it was avant-garde. It contained articles on esoteric and unusual aspects of literary and art history, and included psychoanalytical studies and artistic aspects of anthropology and ethnography. It was a lavish and extravagant magazine by the standards of the 1930s, profusely illustrated with high-quality reproductions of art, often in color. Ratner also illustrated an article for John Dos Passos in Verve magazine in 1931. Still based in Paris, Ratner spent his time making friends in the cafes with artists the likes of Picasso and authors like Henry Miller. Henry Miller and Abraham Ratner were the most unlikely best friends. Henry Miller had sort of a nerdy appearance with his glasses, but it masked this really sort of big macho ego. Whereas Ratner's sort of burly frame and wild, curly mane of hair hid a very gentle soul. Miller loved painting with watercolors and often visited Ratner's studio and saw there a wall of portraits that Ratner painted of Miller on these visits. He loved watching Ratner work and admired his discipline, and soon thereafter, a bromance was born. Throughout his times traveling in Europe and working in Paris, Ratner continued to bring his sketchbooks and his watercolors with him, documenting various locations. Here we can see a selection, selection of photographs of Ratner in his early years, working in Paris and working around Europe. And on the left is one of his sketchbooks, as you can see, detailing these dancers that he saw in these cafes in Paris. One of the most popular areas to travel and visit in Europe at the time was the island of Corsica, most famous, of course, for being the birthplace of Napoleon. It was a popular winter vacation spot for Europeans throughout the 20s and 30s. The blue Mediterranean waters, the warm breezes, the ease of access to the French Riviera, and the rugged beauty of the Corsica island provided the area's charm. Ratner and his wife Bettina visited here several times throughout their years in Europe. On the right, you can see one of the landscapes on view in our gallery that Ratner created from the island of Corsica. Here is another, and on the right, you can see a photograph of Corsica. So you really can see in Ratner's watercolor the coastline, the sense of the boats in the harbor, and it gives you a real sense of being there with him in that immediate moment. The threat of Hitler and of course the rise of the Nazi Party forced Ratner and his wife to flee Paris in the year 1939. Arriving in New York early the next year, Ratner agreed to take a trip by car with his best friend, Henry Miller. Their route took them from New York to New Iberia, Louisiana, via the East Coast and Southern states. Their mission was to rediscover America, with Henry Miller writing about the experiences and Ratner sketching the scenery. This photo album is held at the National Archives of the Smithsonian, and there are hundreds and hundreds of photographs taken on this cross-country road trip between Miller and Ratner. After the visit, Ratner returned to New York, and Miller continued out west, eventually settling in Big Sur, California. The collaborative book never happened between the two. The publisher reportedly did not want Ratner's illustrations included in the book, and so each man ended up writing about his experiences separately. At the time, Ratner's career was taking off in the United States, but Miller was nearly destitute. Miller's books, like The Tropic of Cancer, had been banned in the US for their sexually explicit language. Only in the 1960s, when the Supreme Court overruled obscenity charges, did Miller become widely read and wealthy and revered as sort of a cult figure, as he had been for years in Europe. Throughout their later years, Miller and Ratner continued to write about their admiration for each other in extravagant language that borders on gushing. Ratner's friendship with Henry was an important one that lasted throughout his life. Henry loved painting in watercolors and often asked Ratner for tips on methods and materials. And in this letter that the museum has, it's a typed letter from Abraham Ratner to Henry Miller. And Ratner goes on and on about techniques and tips for painting watercolors in this letter, and actually ended up mailing Miller a package of art supplies to try when Miller had moved to Big Sur. And on the right, you can see Miller in his later years, of course, painting with his watercolors at home. At the Leepa-Rattner Museum of Art, you can come and see some of these beautiful watercolors on view now in our collection galleries, as well as take a peek at some of Ratner's journals and workshop materials that are on view. Watercolors continued to be an important medium for Ratner throughout his artistic career. In the 1940s and 50s, he created watercolor studies to mock up designs for large architectural commissions he received. In the 1960s and 70s, his attention turned to social issues, and his use of the medium in bold brushstrokes expressed his feelings about the civil rights movement and anti-war protests. In 1971, Ratner documented the historic prize fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier in a large series of watercolors, which captured the energy and essence of the match and further defined his commitment to watercolor as a fine art medium. And so we see, beginning in the 1920s, when Ratner won his scholarship to study and live in France and across Europe, watercolors sort of took hold and became a primary medium through which he was able to express urgency and passion, and he used it often, as we saw first in his steerage series and later in these social justice series. We see him using it to sort of depict the plight of the everyday man. The watercolor exhibition on view right now at the Leepa-Rattner Museum of Art highlights only a small amount of the paintings that Ratner created in his time in France. We do have Ratner's sketchbooks and journals at the museum in our archives, and if anyone is interested in viewing those, special arrangements can always be made with the museum and our curatorial team to view these items. And so this sort of wraps up our little gallery tour of the Abraham Ratner French Watercolors exhibition on view now. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I would love to be able to take those now. You can use the chat feature or unmute yourself.
I think you did a wonderful presentation. I thought, is there going to be a test?
No, it's just pass, fail, and you all pass.
Oh, yeah. I used to do a lot of watercolors when we had our gallery up in 1,000 Islands, because people wanted to take a piece of the islands back with them, so I had to paint islands and lighthouses and all that, and I worked mainly in watercolor. But I've always admired artists like this because they're very fluid and very loose. I was always very, very tight with my work. I couldn't get loose with it. I was always looking to totally represent what I was looking at, and got by.
You more than got by. Your work is fantastic, Bob.
Yeah, but I'm totally different than what I'm doing now. I mean, now I don't have to paint realism, and I can paint what's up here and in my heart, rather than what I'm looking at.
I think that what we really see with Ratner's works, consistent throughout his career, especially in his watercolors, is really this embracing of the idea of being able to render. It's sort of that whole idea of abstraction combined with the idea of the immediacy of the artwork. And so it's being able to render things in sort of the most simplest fashion, which also helps convey that emotion and that urgency. Any other questions from anyone this evening?
Well, I'm just kind of surprised by his palette, especially the one that's on the screen now. You know, the use of his blues and the pastels is, I think, very unique.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a wide range, certainly employed between his sketchbooks. We see the pastels sort of in this series from the beach, but you also see, of course, the stronger, sort of darker colors when he's dealing with his steerage series. So he is able to really produce a wide variety of hues that really help convey, again, that the sense of being there. You know, you can imagine these striped cabanas on the pebbled beach in Dieppe, and being there and sort of how that beach would feel. It's a fun, wonderful medium for that reason.
The photograph of his watercolor with the fruit branch, is that pears?
You know, that's a good question. We have it identified as pears. Yeah.
Yeah, on the top it looks like pears.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful
You
piece.
can really see the shape of them in some of the pieces.
Right. I can't believe how many people were on that ship.
it's amazing.
Yeah, we're familiar with steerage because when we worked for the cruise lines, well, they used to put us in steerage, now they put us in the engine room. Not
My
really.
first cruise, I was in steerage.
No.
Ships are bigger,
Yeah,
and you have a little bit more free walkabout.
yeah. I can't imagine. It doesn't even look like you could sit down with the people on the deck up on that picture. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Now this image here is from a 1920s sort of European travel ship. This image here, I think most of us are familiar with. This is an image of the steerage decks as they came into Ellis Island.
Wow.
You know, very different conditions. Again, on sort of these long haul ships versus these short term little cruises up and around the French Riviera.
Yes.
No social distancing.
Not great
None.
at all.
None.
Anyway, no social distancing,
No.
no personal space. And you can really see in this image that Ratner has here, you can really see you know, how this person is sort of huddled up and they have their personal belongings tucked in with them. And it gives you that real sense of what this person is probably feeling and thinking about as they're on this journey. So again, sort of one of the strengths of Ratner's works in general is being able to convey a lot of emotion, convey a lot of passion, and allow you to sort of examine the human condition.
Yes. I see.
Do we have
There was
any other questions tonight?
Well, there was one figural study that was almost Picasso-esque.
His nude series,
Yes,
yes,
that one on the left especially.
absolutely. This influence of sort of the neoclassic style can really be seen in this. And this one was created in the early 1930s, 1932. So at that time, of course, he was already in contact with Picasso. He had already begun to, and you can really see in the image on the right, you can see as he's beginning to move into sort of more angular lines. At this point, it's sort of influenced by Picasso. It could be influenced by Fauvism. We have all of these things that are happening in Paris at the same time that are undoubtedly leaving their mark on Ratner.
I think, especially in the one on the left, you're almost picking up that same, you know, palette. You know, the same colors almost that was in the beach. You know, the beach watercolor.
Absolutely.
You know, the kind of teal blues. You know, very, very delicate.
Yeah, those beautiful pastel
yeah.
colors. Yeah.
Well, we had the gallery, if someone would come in and say, do you think I should take art lessons? I always advise them, be sure to take lessons from an artist that you admire their work, because you're going to definitely be influenced by whoever is teaching you. And obviously he was very fond of Picasso. And I think that the one on the right, that's where the hippie generation first started. Yes.
You definitely can see on the right, particularly as we begin to look at the shadows on those figures and the angular use of the shadows, it's sort of a portent for his exploration of cubism, especially in that image. Yeah. These are incredibly beautiful watercolors. Again, I do encourage everybody to come and see them while they're on view at the museum. Many of our works on paper are not on view often. They have to be rotated out of the galleries and allowed to rest and stay safe from the lights and humidity and all kinds of other things. So when we do get to bring these out of our vaults and put them on view, it's always a great pleasure for us.
Hey, Teresa, thank you. This is the first one of these that I've done. I'm calling in from Seattle. And I grew up knowing Ratner as Uncle Abe. I'm Rose Ratner's grandson.
Oh, wow, welcome.
My mom, who is 90, was on and watched the show. So these are works that none of us have seen. It was really wonderful and great to hear that history and see some of those old photographs.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, it's there's just so many. It's every time we go in the vaults, it's like we see something new. Every time we open a sketchbook or a journal, there's something we haven't noticed before. So I'm so glad that it could bring joy to you tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us. If you do have any questions or you want to get in touch with us at any time, you can always send us an email. You can always give us a call. And we look forward to seeing you in the museum or in our next virtual program soon.
Excellent program, Teresa. Excellent.
Thank you all.
Beautiful,
Thank you for
Teresa.
joining us this evening. Stay safe.
Stay
Stay
safe.
healthy, everyone.
Be good, everybody.
Take care and good night.